it truly makes our matter sin. Your violet flame does all restore. With you we are becoming more.
The sealing.
In the name of the Divine Mother, I fully accept that the power of these calls is used to set free the matter light, so it can outpicture the perfect vision of Christ for my own life, for all people, and for the planet. In the name I am that I am, it is done. Amen.
You are ready with a...
It's recording.
I am the Ascended Master, Saint Germain. Now you have heard a magnificent discourse this morning from Jesus, where he talked about the need to be able to look back at your life and have no regrets, and reason that whatever you went through was because you needed the experience. Well, my beloved, as you may be beginning to realize, we sometimes like to present you with certain that seem like contradictions, like enigmas, and so I will present you with one. You have heard Jesus say that you should be able to look back at your life with no regrets, but then I will submit to you what is the most important characteristic or ability of a student on the higher levels of the spiritual path who is beginning to see or is willing to see the higher aspects of his or her divine plan. Well, it is precisely, my beloved, the ability to admit that you have been wrong. So, how do you reconcile that you should be able to look back at your life with no regrets, with having to admit that you have been wrong? Well, the ego will take Jesus' teaching and say, well, this means I should look back at my life and I should never see that I have been wrong. I have never been wrong. I have never done anything wrong. I just needed that experience, so I never need to feel that I was wrong. And now Saint Germain is saying I should be able to admit when I was wrong. Well, so let us give you a little more teaching, a little different perspective on this. You see, my beloved, it is all a matter of what you put into the word you. You should be able to admit that you have been wrong. Is it the same you I am talking about? What is the you that can be wrong? It is the separate self. Can the separate self ever admit that it has been wrong? No. It isn't capable of it. So, what can admit that it has been wrong? The conscious you, when it is conscious. But the conscious you can at the same time that it is admitting that it has been wrong, see that what was wrong was the external self, the separate self. And in seeing this, it can separate itself from that self, and therefore you realize that while you are admitting that not everything you did in life was perfect, you are at the same time separating yourself from the self that caused you to do this. And this is why you can look back with your life with no regret, because you can actually see that there were certain things you did in your life. And Jesus was not in any way implying that everything you did was okay, was acceptable, was right, according to any normal common sense standard. So he is not implying that you should look back at your life and say, well, I just did it because I needed the experience, so I don't need to learn anything from it. Obviously, you need to learn from it. You need to look at what was the psychology of that separate self that caused you to do this. And therefore, when you uncover that psychology, you can see the decision behind it, you can consciously change that decision, and that is when you can let the separate self die. And at that point, of course, you should have no regrets because you have come up higher. And that is what life is all about. Now, I have many years ago, through a previous Ascended Master dispensation, publicly given awareness and the tools to invoke the violet flame energy, which I chose to call it. We have not necessarily emphasized this as much in this dispensation, partly because so much was said on it previously, but we have, of course, explained what the violet flame is. The violet flame is, in a way, the cosmic eraser. It is an energy of such a vibration that it can be used to erase any lower energy, any fear-based energy in the 4 levels of the material universe. So, when you do something, it produces a certain amount of energy, sometimes also called karma, and before you are completely free of that, you need to consume the karma. And a very efficient way to do this is to invoke the violet flame and use it to consume that energy. Now, I have also said previously that some students in previous dispensations have abused this dispensation of the violet flame because whenever they did something that created misqualified energy, they used violet flame to consume the energy, but they were not willing to look at the psychology behind it, so they just did the same thing again next week, and then again they used the violet flame to erase that, but it didn't really promote their spiritual progress. It is much like some Catholics that can sin, then they go to confession, feel they have been forgiven their sin, and then they lightheartedly go out and sin all over again because they know they can always go back to confession and the priest just have to absolve them of their sins. Well, this is of course not what we want to see because this binds you to a treadmill of your unresolved psychology that you can't get out of. And the violet flame actually helps you not get out of it because instead of being more and more burdened by the energy, you can avoid feeling that burden so you can continue doing what you're doing. And this, of course, isn't what we desire to see. And that is why in this dispensation we have given you so many tools about the psychology and resolving these issues so you can be free of them. Nevertheless, what I wish to give you here is that there comes a point where you have begun to gain greater and greater clarity over your divine plan. But there can still be something that is holding you back from seeing the next level. And what is holding you back is precisely this inability or unwillingness to say, that was wrong. Now, we have of course given many teachings about duality, so when I say you have to be willing to admit you were wrong, I am simply using the concept, the words that are commonly used among people today. We could specify this more, is that what you actually have to be willing to see and admit is that you have had a view of life, a view of yourself, a view and understanding of spiritual teachings that was not the highest possible. Do you understand, my beloved, that if you look at so many areas of the world, let us as an example use the field of religion. Someone has grown up in the Christian faith, in a Catholic church, for example. They have been indoctrinated with the belief that the Catholic Church is the only road to salvation, the only true church. The person has accepted this belief and has believed it. Now, at some point in life, the person begins to see that there are certain contradictions in Catholic doctrine, certain things that can't be explained, certain things that don't make sense, certain things in the history of the church that just can't be in alignment with Christ. but the person is reluctant to admit this at the conscious level. And what is the psychological mechanism? You can say it's ego, you can say it's whatever, but if you really look at the psychological mechanism, it is that many people feel that if they admit that their beliefs that they had, that they adopted at a certain point in the past, if they admit that those beliefs were not the highest possible, that means they would have been wrong. And they're not willing to admit that they had been wrong. In some cases, it can be simple pride. But you are spiritual students, and most of you, pride is not the dominant element of your consciousness. So, what is the mechanism that applies to many spiritual students? Well, this messenger went through it when he was younger. He was in a certain meditation movement. He felt that he had been intuitively led to go into that movement. And therefore, he assumed that when his intuition told him something to go into a certain teaching, that was a genuine teaching and movement. After some years, he began to have doubts about the validity of the movement, but he was at first very reluctant to admit this because he was afraid to acknowledge that the movement was not genuine, the highest possible. And the reason he was afraid to acknowledge this was that then he felt that his intuition would have been wrong for telling him to go into the movement. And if his intuition was wrong and he couldn't trust his intuition, then what could he trust? And he was subconsciously afraid of being thrown into a state of doubt and no man's land, of not feeling he could trust anything. And so there came a point where he was admitting that the movement was not genuine or the highest possible, and he left the movement. But for a couple of years, he went through a state of being angry, feeling betrayed by his intuition, and even deciding he would never again engage in another spiritual movement. Well, as you might know from yourself, whenever you make these kind of decisions, I'm never again going to do this, well, sure enough, you are going to have to do it. And fortunately, this messenger came to a point where he was willing to again trust his intuition when it told him to go into the next spiritual movement, which was an Ascended Master teaching and a genuinely sponsored organization. But it still took him many years to resolve in his mind why his intuition had told him to go into the meditation movement. And it required him to come to the understanding that on the spiritual path, it isn't a matter of being right as the ego sees it. It is a matter of having certain experiences that shift your consciousness. So he realized after quite some time that his intuition had been genuine when telling him to go into the meditation movement, because it was part of his divine plan to have that experience, because he needed to learn something from it. However, his outer mind had interpreted his intuition to mean that when he was told to go into it, it must be a genuine movement. And so you can recognize in yourself perhaps a similar pattern where you feel you had to do something, you feel prompted by your intuition to do something, and so you happily walk down that road that your intuition is pointing you to, and suddenly, wham, bam, you are standing in mud up to your ears, and you are saying, "Why did you tell me to do this?" And so you need to recognize again that you did need that experience. And then you have to say, well, obviously you can go through the same reasoning as I described, and realized that it was because you needed to learn something, you needed to shift your consciousness, and you could only do this through the actual experience. But you can also take this a step further, and you can recognize that the attitude and the beliefs you had about what you did, well, in a certain sense, in the worldly sense, you would say they were wrong because they were not in alignment with a higher reality. And so what I'm saying here is this: when you look at the religious field, for example, you can say, why are there so many people who are still in an outer way loyal to the Catholic Church? Why do they go to church, even if they don't go every Sunday? Why are they members of the church when they don't ever go to church? Well, my beloved, it is in large part because they are not willing to admit that their Catholic beliefs or their belief in the Catholic Church were wrong. And so I understand that there is a stigma, there's a trauma associated with being wrong, because the fallen ones have created a consciousness that is very pervasive in the world, that if you are wrong, it is bad, and it leads to certain dire consequences and punishment and going to hell and this and that. But you are Ascended Master students, and we have given you the tools to pull yourself above that fallen consciousness, where you realize that by being wrong, you are not going to be condemned to hell, because, as we have said, there is nothing you cannot overcome. But the thing is, how do you overcome something? Unless you look at it and honestly admit that you need to let it go instead of holding on to it. Look at the world of religion again. Look how you have the whole concept of Christian apologetics, which is a movement that is meant to justify and explain the Christian faith. So, what are these Christian beliefs based on? The errors inserted by the Catholic Church 17 centuries ago. Are they getting anywhere by seeking to explain away what was erroneous in the beginning? No, of course not. They are just putting themselves into denial. And in denial, you are not going to be able to see the higher aspects of your divine plan. So, this unwillingness to admit that my beliefs were limited, and therefore I need to just let them go and open my mind to a higher realization, a higher experience. This is the key ingredient of a student on the path who wishes to see the higher levels of his or her divine plan. Because so many times you see this, even among Ascended Master students, that they have a certain belief, a certain view, for example, the view of Ascended Masters. And it is not in alignment with reality, and it is holding the students back at a lower level of consciousness. They cannot progress beyond that level. But because they are not willing to admit that their beliefs are not the highest possible, are not in alignment with truth, and that they were quote-unquote wrong, how can they move on? How can they be free of it? Now, in the Ascended Master organization that this messenger was a member of, there was a popular concept that whenever you had some issue come up in your psychology, and you told this to somebody and said, what do I do with this? The people would just say, oh, just put it into the violet flame. And so people would think that anything, any uncomfortability, anything they had come up in their psychology, they just needed to put it into the violet flame. And this messenger once heard a young student in that movement say, they always say to me, just put it into the violet flame, and I do, but it keeps coming back. And of course this is true. If you don't resolve the underlying psychology, it is going to keep coming back. And you can give violet flame over and over again, and it may resolve the energies that are disqualified, so you feel lighter, you don't feel so burdened by it, but the violet flame cannot resolve your psychology, because that can only be done by you making a conscious decision. So you see here, what we are telling you is that as you go to higher levels of your spiritual path, you have the potential to see higher levels of your divine plan. But, what have we told you? You come into embodiment at a certain level of consciousness. Your divine plan was made from a higher level of consciousness. How are you going to see the higher levels of your divine plan? Only by reaching that level of consciousness. How are you going to reach that level of consciousness? Only by looking at the beliefs you had at a lower level of consciousness and acknowledging consciously they were not the highest possible. And some of them were potentially completely out of alignment with reality and therefore erroneous or wrong. So if you can't admit that you've been wrong, you can't progress beyond a certain point. And we have, of course, seen in the religious field, in the political field, in the scientific field, and even among Ascended Master students, that they can go into these almost endless blind alleys of trying to explain why their beliefs were not wrong, or why they were not wrong for having those beliefs. And it is, quite frankly, amazing to see the imagination that people will use in order to explain why their beliefs weren't wrong after all, or why they weren't wrong for having them. But all that is really necessary is to say, I had those beliefs because that was what I could see at the time. Now I have risen to a higher level of consciousness and I can see more. But in order to really implement what I can see, I have to let go of my former beliefs. When I was a child, I spoke as a child. Now I am a man, and I should speak as a man, instead of holding on to my childhood beliefs. And so, my beloved, we see this over and over again. Spiritual seekers have a longing to find something all of their life. They find a spiritual teaching, whatever it may be. Their outer minds reason this must be the ultimate spiritual teaching and the ultimate guru. They decide with their outer minds, perhaps half unconsciously, I'm going to be in this movement the rest of my life. And then I'll ascend or be enlightened or whatever. And so, when it comes to the point where they have now had all the growth they can have from that movement, their minds are closed. And they are not willing to listen to their intuition, who is guiding them to go on to another teaching or another approach to the teaching. Their minds have become rigid, have become solidified around the belief that what they are doing, what they have is enough. And this belief is wrong. It is always wrong, because growth is an ongoing process. So, you have all done this, and there is no shame in it. I'm not blaming you. I'm simply pointing out what is happening. You have all had these points where you thought now you had reached some ultimate understanding, some ultimate belief, and this was what you were supposed to do. Because you all have elements of the ego, and what does the ego want? It wants to feel secure. So, there's no shame in admitting this. It's just what we all went through when we were embodiment, because it's part of the human condition. But the thing is, those who progress on the spiritual path are those who are willing to look at themselves and see this. My ego, my separate selves, they have this tendency. It's not really me who actually believed that I didn't have to look for another teaching. It was a separate self. That's part of my ego. And I am not that separate self. I am more than this. And therefore, the I that I truly am is willing to look at that self and see that the beliefs of that self were wrong. They were outdated. They were limited. And I'm letting them go. And I'm opening my mind to seeing something that I couldn't see through the filter of those limited beliefs. I am, as we have said before, liquefying my mind so it isn't solidified around a certain point, a certain belief. And that, my beloved, is the difference between those who progress to the higher levels of their divine plan and manifest the highest potential of their divine plan, and those who stop at some point before they reach their highest potential. And we, of course, don't want to see you stop before the goal that you yourselves defined for yourselves for this lifetime. It wasn't forced upon you. It was what you wanted. It's not what I want for you. It's what you wanted for yourself. I'm just reminding you. I'm not forcing you. I'm just reminding you of what you actually decided you wanted before you came into embodiment. And I am reminding you of how to get there. And so, how does the violet flame fit into this? Well, if you look back at your life and say, what I did, what I believed, was not the highest possible, perhaps you have even done certain things that clearly put you into a fear-based state of mind and produce misqualified energy, then you do two things. You use the violet flame to envelop that entire situation to consume the energies. Then you use the tools and teachings we have on internal spirit, separate selves, private self, to uncover the belief behind it and to change that belief and thereby let that separate self die. And then you accept, my beloved, that now you're done with it. It's over. It's to the point where it doesn't even exist anymore. There is a sentence in the Bible that the Lord says, I shall remember their sins no more. Well, my beloved, it may be that God is able to forget your sins, but are you? Are you able to forget the so-called mistakes you have made? And what I'm saying here is this. You can use the violet flame to consume the energy. Then the energy is gone. It is not there anymore. It is as if it never existed. You can let that separate self die, and then the separate self is not there anymore. It is as if that separate self never existed. But there can still be an element of your consciousness, and it isn't actually the conscious you, it's another separate self. But there can still be that element of your consciousness that remembers what you did and is projecting that you need to continue to remember this, and you need to somehow feel sorry for it, or you need to somehow compensate for it, or you need to whatever, put your attention upon it. But I'm telling you, once you have done the cleanup work, what you need to do is step back and see that there is this other separate self, perhaps even fallen beings or other people projecting this upon you. And then you need to say, you're not me. I don't want you in my life anymore. I am letting you die. And then you need to accept that you don't actually need to remember this anymore. You don't need to put your attention on it whatsoever. And many of you will actually be tested time and time again because the fallen beings will keep projecting this at you, reminding you of this. Maybe there are people in your family or in your relationships who will keep reminding you of what you did to me those many years ago and why you should still feel sorry for it, because they feel sorry for themselves for it. They haven't resolved the psychology that caused them to react. They haven't resolved the energy. They haven't let go of it. But then again, you have to say, okay, I respect free will. And I respect that you have your free will. If you want to hold on to what happened in the past, I respect your right to do this. But I have equal respect for my own free will that I have a right to put this behind me. And if you're not willing to do the same, that's fine, but I am putting it out of my life. I'm putting myself out of my misery, so to speak. And, my beloved, you then have the option, in some cases, that if a person that is in your family or in your relationships, will not let go of the past, you may come to a point where you say, I just have to let you go. I just have to let you out of my life, to select you out of my life, because it isn't constructive for me to be associated with a person who keeps revolving around the past and is not willing to overcome it. This is a right you have, my beloved, regardless of how they blame you and how they tell you, you can't just leave me, you can't just walk away from me. But my beloved, you have the right to do this if you feel this is right for you. I'm not telling you what to do. I'm telling you, you have the right to make that choice even if other people will not let go of the past. And so, my beloved, truly, you cannot overcome a limited belief without seeing that it was limited. Now, how do you see that a belief is limited? Well, at least at a certain level, you see it that it is limited compared to a belief that is higher, that is broader, that is more expansive. And so this brings up one of these catch-22s that people can get into.